All right, what's up, everybody? Miss Lynch here, and I'm back for the second half of chapter 11. Okay, so last thing we were talking about, last thing I was talking about was abolition in the Americas. Okay, so now then let's get to slavery and liberty. Okay, so this is kind of going back to, I'm actually not gonna hit on this too much because basically what it came down to was racist Southern Caucasians declared themselves the true heirs of the American Revolution. Okay, and this had a lot to do with uh, the pro-slavery argument of the South that the Declaration of Independence, you know, it wasn't a universal entitlement, and it was really just for them. Okay. Okay, so that's still a part of our pro-slavery movement. All right. So our next slide, let's get to life under slavery. Okay, so slaves were considered property and had few legal rights. All states made it illegal to kill a slave except in self-defense, and slaves accused of serious crimes were entitled to their day in court, albeit before all Caucasian judges and juries. Okay, so slaves were not allowed to testify against a Caucasian person, carry a firearm, leave a plantation without permission, learn how to read or write, gather in a group without a Caucasian person. Um, yeah, although not all these laws were always enforced, they did exist. Okay. All right. Masters also controlled whether slaves married and how they spent free time. Um, yeah, this, yes. So a lot of, marriage and birth and death dates and information, um, we we don't know. It was never documented. So yeah, basically, yeah, masters had control over this, and they didn't legally acknowledge it anyway. So, okay, and then slaves could be leased or sold by their owners at their discretion. Okay, conditions of slave life. Some laws protected slaves against mistreatment. Kind of like we mentioned in the previous slide, it was illegal to kill a slave except in, self-defense. So there were laws in place to protect slaves um, in some instances. Okay, American slaves, as compared to their counterparts in the West Indies or Brazil, enjoyed better diets. There was a lower infant mortality rate because of the environment, and there were longer life expectancies due to the lack of malaria, yellow fever. So that comes down to environment, um, water, humidity, all of that, where, you know, mosquitoes and disease like to thrive, right? So standing water, swamps, stuff like that, right? Okay. Okay. Enjoyed better diets, longer, and then the high costs of slaves. Okay. Improvements in slaves' living conditions were meant to strengthen slavery, not undermine it, which is something we talked about last time. And few slave societies in history have so systematically closed off all avenues of freedom as the Old South. Yeah. Okay. So let's look at free African Americans in the Old South. Okay, so by 1860, so this is, the beginning of the Civil War, there were 500,000 free African Americans in the United States, and most of them lived in the South. They were allowed by law to own property and marry, and could not be bought or sold. Let's see, they were not allowed by law to own a firearm, dogs, or liquor, and they could not testify in court or serve on a jury. All right, so there are still a lot of legal provisions in place to limit liberties. Okay. The majority of free African Americans who lived in the lower South resided in cities like New Orleans and Charleston, which were or had prosperous communities. Okay. Okay. So um, many of these individuals were formally educated in one way or another and worked as skilled craftsmen. And the majority lived in the upper South and rural areas rather than like the deep South that we've been talking about, and worked for wages as farm laborers. Okay. Okay, so slave labor. All right. So physical labor occupied most of a slave's daily existence. There were many types of jobs that one might perform. So cutting wood, working in mines or docks, on the railroads, bridges, roads, so construction jobs, or working as skilled artisans, depending on, it's like blacksmiths, stuff like that. Okay, but most slaves worked in the fields, the start cotton industry. So it's estimated that 75% of women and 90% of men worked as field hands, and the largest concentration of slaves lived and worked on plantations in the cotton belt. Okay, so our deep south, right? Okay, on the larger plantations, they worked in gangs under the direction of an overseer, who was generally a man who would often be deemed cruel, abusive. Okay, so some of the harshest conditions in these fields came from Louisiana sugar fields. Okay, also rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia. Um, well, so they still worked on the colonial era task system, where you were given, a task for the day, and then whenever you completed it, you can go home. So, in comparison to the Deep South, uh, the rice plantations were the more progressive of, our uh, slave industries. Okay. Okay. So, slavery in the cities. So, most city slaves were servants, cooks, or domestic laborers, again, skilled artisans, and occasionally they were permitted to live on their own. Okay, and the system of maintaining order rested on um, force, right? So enforcing the system, like I said, whenever something that at this point it was perceived that slavery was the status quo. So then it became kind of a prerogative to reinforce that status quo. Okay. All right. So there were many tools a master had to maintain order, which included whips, um, exploiting division amongst slaves, offering incentives, and then also threats, threats of physical violence, threat of sale, threat of dividing your family. So just threats, okay? Which is going back to the top of the slide, um, doing this by forms of cruelty and psychic abuse, okay? So slave culture. Um, like we said, the importation of slaves from Africa ended in 1808. And so from 1808 going to the Civil War, um, this institution, like I said, is just reinforcing itself. It's morphing into this different being that it's been in the past. And so slave culture becomes its own distinguished entity, we'll say. Okay. Okay. So the slave family. Slaves never abandoned their desire for freedom or determination to resist their bondage. Despite the threat of sale and the fact that marriage between slaves was illegal, many slaves did marry and create families, which that goes back to what I was saying a minute ago. You know, marriage and divorce and things like that, they were not legally recognized, um, but they still went on, they still occurred, okay? So these are normal, these are just things that people do. These are human um, progressions that are being made, okay? Okay, slaves frequently named children after other family members to retain their family continuity, and the slave community had a significantly higher number of female-headed households than the Caucasian community. All right, so going back to the idea of, ongoing threats and that always remaining as a possibility. Um, but so the threat of sale, our section on our next slide here. So in many states, 1 in 3 slave marriages were broken by sales. Many children were separated from their families because of this. And slave traders, they did little to preserve family ties because they didn't recognize them, which is something that goes back to what I said in our last slide and before, but it wasn't recognized, so they didn't care. Okay. All right, gender roles. So traditional gender roles were not followed in the fields. Like I said, men and women were laboring together. And during their own time, however, slaves did fall back on traditional gender roles within their family dynamics. Okay. Okay, so religion. Um, okay, so there is the rise of Black Christianity in the South during this time. So this was distinctive and offered hope to many slaves. And okay, so almost every plantation had its own African American preacher. Slaves worshipped in biracial churches, and free African Americans established their own churches, which is a shift that happens following the Civil War. Yeah, that will happen on a larger scale. Okay, but so as free African Americans are permitted, I say quote unquote, but literally and figuratively, permitted to create their own churches, we'll see that happening more. Okay, but in the antebellum South, slaves were worshiping in biracial churches. Um, but there is this distinct Black Christianity that develops. Okay. So some masters required services with Caucasian ministers who emphasized obedience. And this goes back to that paternalism that I was talking about, that patriarchal model of your master is your father, and in the bigger picture, God is our father beyond that. So, this system of obedience, we're always taught to be obedient to our father who is above us, and then they are expected to then be obedient to um, the capital F father, right? Okay, so, but these messages of obedience are just it's meant to reinforce the um, it's just trying to reinforce this whole system of slavery at every possible level, even within religion. Okay. All right. Where's she at? Okay. So slaves transformed Christianity, which is going back to what I'm saying, turning to their own purposes. Many biblical stories offered hope and solace to slaves, including Exodus, um, which during Reconstruction, the era immediately after the Civil War, there is an exodus for those who can afford to leave, who have the means to do so. But there is an exodus of freed people from the South Kansas will be a hot spot. Oklahoma Territory, whenever that's open, that becomes that too. But literally, there is an exodus, and the imagery behind that comes from the biblical exodus itself. Okay. Okay. So a desire for liberty, which this goes back to the American Revolution. This goes back to everything we've been talking about, the concept of freedom and liberty, and who is deserving of that. All right. Which all of that, it can fuel either side of the argument. Okay. Like we said with our pro-slavery argument, they were arguing that um, they were the true heirs of the American Revolution, that the Declaration of Independence was about them and no others, right? While other people are saying, does this not apply to all of us? Does mankind not mean humankind, right? Okay, so this is just really getting us into the abolitionist conversation that's beginning to balloon up and will it's just going to lead us to the Civil War. No spoilers, but that's where we are moving towards. Okay. So the desire for liberty. All right. So slave culture rested on a sense of the injustice of bondage and the desire for freedom. Slave folklore glorified the weak over the strong, which is very, very biblical when it comes down to it. The meek shall inherit the earth, right? And their spirituals emphasized eventual liberation. Okay, slaves used networking and thus new political events and activities of abolitionists. All right, so this will help fuel our abolitionist movement eventually. And this goes back to what I was saying, although there's a typo in there again. Sorry, guys. Okay, the ideal of the American Revolution strengthened the desire for freedom, not for freedom, for freedom. Like I said, who, what is freedom and liberty, and who deserves to have it? Okay. All right, so our resistance to slavery. We're starting to get into the abolitionist time period, okay? All right. People are organizing. It's growing, okay? So because slaves were outnumbered, slave rebellions were actually rare. We've talked about some throughout, our studies. There are always rebellions popping up during every bit of stuff that we've talked about because history was not as nice and calm and peaceful as we have been told, especially in regards to leading up to the American Revolution, right? Anyway, so slave rebellions were relatively rare, um, but many other forms of resistance existed. Okay, the most common form of resistance was silent sabotage. So this was done little things to make life harder for slave owners and their operations. So this would be like the breaking of tools, feigning illness, doing poor quality work. So just making it more difficult, right? Okay, so that's our silent sabotage. You could consider it being passive aggressive in some ways, okay? So it's less common, but more severe forms of resistance included poisoning. So there are instances of poisoning, arson, armed assaults, okay? But so resistance is happening, that's the point. Okay, slaves who ran away were even more threatening to the slave system because they were then able to go out and talk about their experience and educate others about, what this institution was really like, okay? Okay, so slaves had to follow the North Star as their guide. This starts to take us into the Underground Railroad, okay? So in the Deep South, fugitive slaves often escaped to southern cities to blend in with the free black population. Okay, so like I said, this takes us to the Underground Railroad. So this will develop as a system of what's the word I'm looking for? Well, safe places, really, which were mostly known farms, going from the south up through the north, to the north, even to Canada. Um, and this became a network. All right. So this was a loose organization of abolitionists who were helping slaves to escape. Harriet Tubman is, our most well-known member of this network, right? Okay, so she helped. Um, okay, so she was mainly working during the 1850s, leading up to the Civil War, and she made 20 return trips to Maryland. So remember the Mason-Dixon line, Pennsylvania, Maryland. So she was going over into Maryland to bring slaves to the north. Okay. All right. So let's talk about some of the rebellions that are going on leading up to. Well, our next chapter, we're really going to focus on the abolitionist movement. But so these are some rebellions that are leading up to this and showing that um, the true root of all of this evil, and we're beginning to grow resistance. Okay. So slave revolts is our next slide. Okay, 1839, a group of slaves collectively seized their freedom while on board the Amistad. There's a movie about it. It was on the movie list. I don't think I've seen anybody watch it yet, but it was a good movie. Okay, so there's the Amistad Rebellion. The U.S. Supreme Court accepted John Quincy Adams's argument that slaves had been illegally seized in Africa and should be freed. So this is that very progressive. This is this push towards abolitionism. All right. Okay, so slave revolts. In 1811, an uprising on the sugar plantations in Louisiana saw slaves marching from New Orleans before the militias were called out and they were recaptured. Okay, 1822, um, Denmark Vesey was charged with conspiracy and executed in South Carolina. He was a religious man. There's a typo. Golly, I feel like every slide has had a typo in this one. Sorry. It says vessel. I think it's just supposed to say VC again. But he was a religious man who believed the Bible condemned slavery, and he saw the hypocrisy in the Declaration of Independence, spreading that word of freedom and liberty when slavery exists, right? Okay. Um, okay. So there was a conspiracy uncovered before they could act. All right, and then this brings us to Nat Turner's rebellion. Okay, so Nat Turner was a slave preacher and a religious mystic. He believed that God had chosen him to lead an uprising. And in 1831, he and his followers marched through Virginia, attacking Caucasian American farmers and their families. So 80 slaves joined Turner, and 60 Caucasians were killed as a result, mostly women and children, before the militia squashed their rebellion. So Nat Turner was then captured and executed. And as a result of this, there was a shockwave sent through the South. The Virginia legislature debated plans for gradual emancipation, fearing more uprisings. Plans for gradual emancipation of the state's slaves, but voted not to take the step. Okay, it's worded in a weird way, sorry. Instead, Virginia tightened its grip on slavery through new laws, further limiting slaves' rights. So they went the opposite way with it. The year 1831 marked a turning point for the Old South as white Southerners closed their ranks and defended slavery more strongly than ever. So as all that progressive abolitionism is beginning, there's then this counter-offensive of racist Caucasian Southerners bonding together. Okay. Anywho, so that's chapter 11. Woo. Okay, so that is, like I said, how slavery had been reinforcing itself in the South, how it grew, how it morphed, and how it leads to our abolitionist movement in speaking out against all of this, okay? Which is what will take us into chapter 12, okay? So if you guys have any questions about anything, excuse me, email me, and otherwise I will see you back here for chapter 12, okay? I hope you guys have a good week. Hopefully you get your power back. Hopefully everything else in the world is a little calmer. We'll see. Okay, anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. I will see you guys back here for chapter 12, okay? Take it easy. Bye.